I want you to picture the room. There's a low table, it's a tropical afternoon, the kind of heat in the air that makes you feel like it's working against you. 3 or 4 men sitting around a table and tea service is brought in. Captain Kees Briaire of the Dutch military mission is one of the men, and Briaire is the one who tells this story later, 3 years later, in the summer of 1983, when De Volkskrant will run his name in print. Now, in the middle of the room, on his knees, is a Dutch colonel, and the colonel is pouring tea. The man he's pouring it for is a former sergeant, 34 years old at the time of the coup the previous February, and for all practical purposes, the operational head of the country ever since, Bouterse. The colonel kneeling on the floor in front of him is Gerrit van Marseveen, the head of the Dutch military mission, defense attaché, the man The Hague sent to put the Suriname problem back in its box. Briaire's quote about this picture that he will give in 1983 is 5 words long. We thought, what are we witnessing? Now hold on to that question for just a minute. We're going to come back to it, because what Briaire is going to suggest strongly in print 3 years after the fact is that he was witnessing a public humiliation. A senior officer of one of Europe's oldest standing armies forced into a posture of servile deference to a non-commissioned officer who had shot his way to power. The reading of the whole situation is almost cinematic, the kind of scene that explains itself. There is just one problem with the reading, and that's that Briaire was the witness. Briaire was also the man whose rogue mission members had spent the previous 12 months ensuring that the colonel ended up on that floor. See, Marseveen had been in Paramaribo for 11 months by the time that the tea was poured. And the story of how he got there, how the most decorated, most experienced Suriname expert in the Dutch officer corps ended up on his knees in front of the man he had been sent to manage, is the story of one extraordinary year. The year of 1980 to 1981. The year that broke a professional investigator. This is what that episode is about. But it's not the story that Briaire tells. If you've been following along since episode 8, The Handler, you have met Gerrit van Marseveen before, briefly. He was the career counterintelligence officer who guarded Sukarno and Sharir and Salim in a Sumatran mountain village called Burasatgi for 10 days in December of 1948 when he was 20 years old and the United Nations Security Council was demanding the prisoners' release, but his own soldiers wanted to shoot them and call it an escape attempt. So he had spent the next 3 decades living in that gap between what soldiers wanted to do and what an institution requires of them. So he was very precise, very formal, the kind of man who likes to write things down, the kind of man, when Hans Valk's names came up, would flush red, even years later in conversations with subordinates who couldn't tell why. You're going to spend this episode watching that man come apart at the seams. Marseveen was, in May of 1980, exactly the kind of man you would have wanted for this job. 14 years of Suriname work inside Dutch intelligence from 1964 to 1976. Marseveen had sat in Lamed, the Dutch military intelligence, where Bureau Suriname was his main desk. The monthly reports came up through S2 Trieste, the intelligence section of the Dutch troops still stationed in Suriname during the long colonial wind-down, and Marseveen reviewed them in close coordination with the BVD, the BVD. So when the country gained independence in 1975 and the Suriname brief shifted from military to civilian intelligence, the IDB, Marseveen followed along with it. So 2 years at the IDB from 1976 to 1978, he was the institutional through line on Surinamese affairs across the agency reorganization. So through that decade and a half, while most of the Dutch establishment was treating Suriname as a sentimental obligation that was about to graduate to independence, Maar was tracking the political and economic tectonic shifts, the radicalization of the PNR, the Communist Party of Suriname and its study groups, the slow drift of the officer corps to the left. He saw the Cuban tilted left forming up, and he saw the rightward correction coming up to meet it. And he filed reports, and those reports ended up in drawers somewhere. The Surinamese government, when independence came in 1975, said publicly they wanted him as the head of the Dutch military mission. That would help the new country build out its army. So your first choice was Maar because of his extensive contacts and involvements in the independence preparation. The second choice was Lieutenant Colonel de Jong, who also had regional experience. In The Hague, they ignored both of those preferences and instead appointed Hans Valk, who was the son of the Queen's adjutant instead. You can read what you want to read into that choice of Valk. We've already spent multiple episodes covering it. What matters for this episode, though, is what happened 5 years later, in the late spring of 1980, after Valk's protégés had pulled off the coup. His mission had not exactly prevented, and the Dutch state realized that it needed somebody on the ground who could actually clean things up. In late spring of 1980, the Dutch military mission promoted Lieutenant Colonel Maar to full colonel and sent him to Paramaribo to replace Hans Valk. So the transition would be official on June 16th. Now, on paper, Maar was taking Valk's old dual posting. Valk had been the head of the Dutch military mission and the military attaché. But the architecture behind the titles there had been quietly and deliberately altered. Valk had been an army attaché, landmacht attaché in the Dutch terminology, and his reporting lines fell under the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And the civilian ambassador, Fekelen, had sat in his chain of command. This is why they were always getting into loggerheads and butting heads about what was communicated and what not. So that created all kinds of tension and problems and communications breakdown during the sergeant's coup. And the historian Ellen de Vries, looking back at the arrangements decades later, summarized it in one phrase. In retrospect, a strange construction. So you had two hats, but they had a different leash. Okay, so Maar was sent in as the defense attaché. The title was a bureaucratic sleight of hand. It severed the diplomatic leash, so the man who would now run the mission would also have a direct, unvarnished counterintelligence line back to the defense ministry in The Hague with no civilian filter ambassador in between. So two hats, one man, the same two hats Valk had worn. What was new was who had the leash. So that move did not happen quietly. On June 10th of 1980, the CCIV, which was the inter-service committee that coordinated Dutch intelligence work across the army, the Foreign Intelligence Service, and the Security Service, they met and they registered the personnel change in its official minutes. You can see it on the screen here. So the Defense Ministry made the promotion. The CCIV took note of it on paper. And what that minute records show is small, but it's telling. In the section listing personnel changes, Maar new posting was written down with a slash. You see DFAT/LAMAT, which is Defense Attaché / Army Attaché. So both titles at once, mid-transition. It was happening real time. The old name and the new name held in the same sentence, but you can still see the bureaucratic seam visible in that document. You can also see the redacted term Lieutenant Colonel promoted to Colonel, who would later deploy in mid-June 1980 to Suriname to succeed the previous mission head as DFAT/LAMAT. So We know that that is Marsevain because of the combination of the rank, date, and the posting. So read that like a job description. The Hague was admitting, based upon the structure of the new position that they were creating, that what had gone wrong with the mission could not be allowed to go wrong again. They were sending Marsevain with explicit counterintelligence mandate. And he arrived in Paramaribo on May 24th of 1980. 3 months after the coup, he stepped off the plane at Zandere thinking that he could fix the problem, the mess that Valk had left behind. Now, what he found 6 days before he had ever taken formal command was an invitation. Captain Clements, soon to be Marsevain's senior subordinate, recently host of the Bouterse victory party after the coup, had organized a farewell reception for Hans Valk at Fort Zeelandia. Now, the date on that invitation is June 10th, 1980. Marsevain kept the card, his invitation, and years later, going through his files, he would mark the date in a red line as evidence that the climate of his mission was, in the moment that he inherited, severely poisoned against him. He was wrong about what he had been sent to fix, but the way that he was wrong was not exactly what you would expect. So the handover ceremony, Valk to Marsevain, was mediated by the outgoing ambassador, Jonkheer Max Wegelin von Klerberen. And it was a piece of theater that tells you everything about the tension inside the mission. So Wegelin refused to shake Valk's hand. He said, "You, Colonel, I will not shake your hand." Then he turned to his replacement, Marsevain, and said, "And you, Colonel, should not think that I will shield you as I did him." 15 words, one day. Marsevain received them as a warning. The ambassador was telling him that the diplomatic shield that Valk had been operating under for 5 years had been withdrawn, that Marsevain was on his own, and this is the part that wouldn't be obvious till later, that the ambassador knew the inside of the mission would not back its new commanding officer. Marsevain heard the warning. He just didn't understand yet the source. He thought the threat was coming from the outside, but it wasn't. Here's what nobody told Marsevain on his first day on the job. The mission he had just inherited had hosted Bouterse's victory party. We covered the whole post-coup celebration at Captain Clement's house in the Handler episode. The NCOs who had overthrown Suriname arriving at Marsevain's future subordinates' homes within an hour of the coup. Clement's later admission that he had advised them the Vrij Nederland framing of the mission as having hosted the after party of the sergeant's coup. This is the inheritance that Marsevain walked into. What he didn't know yet was the same household which had hosted the celebration was about to start hosting the campaign against him. In August of 1980, at an army reception in Paramaribo, Mrs. Clements, Captain Clements' wife, pulled aside two senior Surinamese officers, then Battalion Commander Henk Fernandez and Garrison Commander Roy Horb. The new colonel, she told them, was a spion, a spy. Marsevain, when writing about the incident a year later in his internal reports, would describe Mrs. Clements as a woman who, quote, knew no bounds in the area of alcohol. He was not being kind. He was not exactly calling her a drunk, but close. And he was calling it as he saw it. In the same passage of the same report, Marsevain documented something else. Captain Clements, Mrs. Clements' husband, the post-celebration coup host, the then senior mission member who was already drifting steadily out of his commanding officer's reach, had entered into what Marsevain described as a very intimate relationship with the secretary at the National Army. He was not hiding it. He was, in Marsevain's words, not refraining from presenting this relationship as such to members of the Dutch community. Captain Clements was flaunting an affair with a Surinamese army secretary in front of the Dutch community in Paramaribo, while his wife was working 2 tables over to convince the Surinamese army that the new Dutch colonel was an enemy. And he would not stop there. After Marsevain's evacuation from Suriname in 1981, May of 1981, on a brief return visit to the Paramaribo, Clements would tell members of the Dutch community openly, with his Surinamese girlfriend present, that Marsevain had never been welcome in Suriname, that he himself had personally worked to prevent the colonel's arrival, and that an ex-military addressee in his audience would, back in his day, have certainly shot a boss like that to pieces. Which is a very interesting choice of words given what the NCOs had just done to Fred Ormskirk. About his own continued visits to the Memrabuku barracks, despite being forbidden expressly to do so, Captain Clement said, "It is forbidden for me, but who would track my movements here?" So this wasn't mere gossip, it was a campaign, and Mrs. Clements was not running it alone. You see, the campaign had 3 different channels. Mrs. Clements ran the one out in the open, at the army receptions and parties, in the public moments where a senior Dutch officer's wife told senior Surinamese officers face-to-face in front of a witness that the new colonel was a spy. Major Joop Koyman ran the second channel, which we'll come to in just a moment. The third channel ran through the man that Marsevain still thought he could trust, which was a Major Nace, the Plaatsvervang Hoofd MMS, Marsevain's own deputy, the number 2 man in the mission. The man whose office was next to Marsevain's, who handled the mission's day-to-day administration, who was supposed to be the colonel's institutional safety net inside the whole mess of a mission that he had inherited. Marsevain knew that Nace was playing both sides. He would later officially describe his deputy in the Dutch words a counterintelligence officer chooses on purpose as weinig stabiel in bijzonder der wankelmoedig, which means very unstable, very fickle. Marsevain documented that Nace would claim to his face that he was just acting as a buffer between Marsevain and the mutinous Valkeneers, while behind Marsevain's back, Nace was drafting open telegrams to The Hague demanding his commanding officer's removal. The full truth about what Nace had been doing came out later, inside of a Dutch military intelligence interrogation. In the summer of 1981, after the mission had been recalled to the Netherlands, Major Koenders sat Nace down for an official debrief. Now, Koenders was a tough interviewer. He pressed hard. Nace nearly came to blows with him, and when the conversation was finally over, Koenders had extracted, in his own words, for his own classified report, the admission that would define everything that followed. Nace had identified completely with the National Army and its current leaders. He had admitted, after some pressing, that the mission members had been aware of the coup before the night that it happened. He admitted to having cooperated in the campaign against Colonel Marsevain, and immediately after the debrief, Nace panicked. He refused to have any further contact with Koenders, telling colleagues he had put the whole matter behind him. The campaign Marsevain was about to walk through in late 1980 and into the spring of 1981 was a 3-front operation. He saw 2 of the fronts, and the third was being run by a man on the other side of the wall. So Major Joop Koeman was a fresh arrival who landed at the mission July 20th, 1980, a full month after Marsevain had taken command, and who almost immediately attached himself to the Valkeneers. He began making the same spy case through the same Surinamese officer in roughly the same window. The new major didn't drift into the Valk loyal faction, he chose it. Within weeks of stepping off the plane in Paramaribo, Koeman had aligned himself with the mission members who were undermining his commanding officer. Koeman's posting to Paramaribo wasn't on its face a quiet personnel rotation. The Bouterse regime had asked for him by name. On July 7, 1980, Dutch newspapers began reporting that the Surinamese government and the National Military Council, Bouterse's junta, had jointly requested his appointment and that the Dutch cabinet had granted it. The Dutch Army Information Service told the press that Marsevain, 3 weeks into his tenure, was the man who, quote, fits better with the sergeants than his predecessor had, and that Major Joop Koeman, his new advisor, also, quote, met the requirements of the military leaders in Paramaribo. So both men, according to the Dutch Army's own PR framing, were placed to please the Bouterse regime. What Marsevain actually walked into said something wildly different. The whole fits better with the sergeant's line was the Dutch Army's Information Service's spin on what was happening. The kind of friendly framing a press office puts on things when a contested appointment needs to look smooth. This is not how Marsevain had built his career. And it was not how he behaved in Paramaribo. Within weeks, Bouterse was treating him with blatant disrespect. Within months, Mrs. Clements was at her August reception telling Captain Fernandez and Captain Horb that he was a spy. So the Dutch Army's PR framing had been managed. The mission's actual day-to-day reality had not. So Koeman was not new to Suriname. He had been a Trieste officer in Suriname in 1963 and 1964, the same colonial-era Dutch military presence whose intelligence section, the S2 Trieste, was the local branch of the Dutch's stay-behind apparatus, and whose monthly reports Marsevain had spent years reading and cataloging at Lamet. So Koeman had been there. His job in 1980 was, per the Dutch press, organizing training for the Surinamese armed forces, directly hands-on working with Bouterse's army. On July 10th, 1980, 10 days before Koeman's plane landed in Paramaribo, the Leeuwarder Courant ran an interview with Sergeant Chas Mangels, the member of the National Military Council. When he was asked about Koeman's incoming role, Mangels issued a public threat. The new Dutch advisor would have to support the idea of a development army, meaning the politicized army doing educational and economic work the radical left faction wanted. And he continued, if they do not perform, they will be dismissed. So a sergeant in a junta talking publicly to the Dutch press about a Dutch officer he had never met, as if Mangels personally had hiring and firing authority over him. Now, Mangels would be arrested by Bouterse a little over a month later on August 13th, 1980, the day Bouterse purged the radical left faction of his own National Military Council. By the time Mrs. Clements was at her August reception telling Captain Fernandez and Horb that the new Dutch colonel was a spy, the Surinamese officer who had publicly threatened to dismiss Koeman was sitting in a jail cell. So the mission's spy rumors against Marsevain were running in the same window of time that the Bouterse regime was eliminating its left flank. So there's no concrete evidence that the convergence of these things was being coordinated, and it doesn't have to be. Both sides of the arrangement were closing in on the same outcome. Bouterse consolidated as the moderate candidate, Marsevain marginalized inside of his own mission, and the mission's Valk-era relationships with the Bouterse circle were being preserved. The mission members had something else they were protecting. Beyond their relationships with the Bouterse circle and their political alignment with the post-coup regime, they were protecting their pocketbooks. Working at the Dutch military mission in Paramaribo in the early 80s paid well. The base salary was supplemented by an overseas allowance and diplomatic perks and housing benefits for the senior officers. They had representation funds intended to cover the cost of official entertaining and diplomatic hosting. The mission members were enjoying themselves financially. uitstekend in the assessment of one ex-mission member who would later talk to the Dutch reporter. Going home to the Netherlands service meant what one ex-military member called a financial bloodletting. A Enderlanding. That's not to mention the beautiful Surinamese women that the mission men had grown attached to. You had Hans Valk, who was having relations with members of the Surinamese secretary pool in the 1970s. You had another Surinamese secretary married a member of the military mission. You have Clements marrying a Surinamese woman. You have Dick Staphorst marrying a Surinamese woman. And then Clements having an affair with a Surinamese woman. So things were good in Paramaribo. Money's good. Temperature's good. The food's amazing. The culture's beautiful. And there's women that the members of the military mission do not want to leave anytime soon. So Marsevain, upon his arrival as the new mission head, he tried to audit the books. He asked his senior captains, Briaire and Clements, to account for their representative portion, the slush fund, of their foreign exchange income. This is just standard institutional housekeeping for any new commanding officer coming in with diplomatic status subordinates. Both men refused. They wouldn't open their books. Marsevain's right-hand man, Peter Maar, later recalled, quote, "The colonel was extremely annoyed by the behavior of the Dutch soldiers. They earned 7,000 or 8,000 guilders net, had their own businesses on the side, and did nothing but party and visit prostitutes. They even brought their girlfriends into the office." So Marsevain documented their refusal in the same August 1981 report that we've been reading throughout the episode. And he listed the cause, his own breakdown as to why the mutiny had happened. His seventh point, his sub-conclusion, put in plain Dutch, was Het naya kun van e kun fi na sina. Well, forget it. Pretty much, in English, the pursuit of their own financial interest. That pursuit was not subtle. Adjutant Laura, the mission member who would be named later by his fellow officers and the one who would be bragging about having the post-coup celebration and advice at Captain Clement's house, he spent the post-Marsevain years or evenings drinking at the Hotel Kranopolski in Paramaribo. He drank heavily. He bitterly complained to anybody who was within earshot about the new colonel. He openly longed for the Valk-era, the administrative officer who eventually replaced Clements at the embassy. Peter Maar, you may remember him, who died on Westlandweg 18 months later. He wrote down in a letter to Marsevain that Laura at the Krasnopolski was missing how things used to be. Zuipen and Financieel, boozing and financially better. So the financial motive wasn't new. It had already surfaced in Dutch military security debriefing 6 weeks before Marsevain even arrived in Paramaribo. On April 24th, 1980, a mission member named T.H. van Boegaard had met with the Dutch ministry's security section in The Hague. This may have been even Harn Reinders or someone like that. Boegaard had come home ahead of the rest of the mission, and he had things to tell the Dutch intelligence about his commanding officer, Hans Valk. Among them was that Colonel Valk had wanted to stay in Suriname for the money. Boegaard, you could consider him a hostile witness or informant, at least, passing along mission gossip. And some of what he told the mission security that day, including a wholly separate claim that Valk himself had orchestrated the Surinamese government's request to keep him on. Some of it was just completely false. But 16 months later, when Marsevain sat down to write his classified August 1981 report on the mission's collapse, the financial motive line made its way into his text. Without citation, it had been lifted from a year-old debriefing of dubious credibility into the intelligence official record. So what that tells us is that by that point in time, Marsevain, in August of 81, who had been historically a careful counterintelligence professional, the man who'd spent 20 years writing measured reports in Surinamese assessments, he had even gotten to the point where he was using some of his subordinates' unverified hostile testimony as evidence in his own indictment. Not because he was sloppy necessarily, but because by August of 80, after a year of being systematically undermined by an institution that was supposed to have his back, by being publicly labeled a spy, undermined by the Bouterse regime, and ultimately being chased out of Paramaribo under the threat of death and physical violence, by that time, his rules or his levels of evidentiary discipline had narrowed a little bit to the point where the claims that confirmed what he already believed found their way into the mission report, and they passed along as classified evidence as opposed to just being a footnote. So that's what the mission had done to him. So none of these financial motives changed the core argument about politics and Bouterse circle loyalty. The Vulcaneers were still loyal to Valk, and they had Bouterse circle relationships and that they wanted to preserve. And they still had political reasons they wanted Marsevain gone. But layered on top of the politics was the simple math. A new mission head who actually ran a tight ship at the mission, who actually enforced the Dutch chain of command and discipline, who actually asked his senior captains to open their books. That man was a threat to a nice and comfortable arrangement with money and women and all the good things, the nice things in life. The mission members were defending more than just a worldview. They were defending their way of life. And Laura at the bar told the truth out loud. And Marsevain in The Hague the following summer wrote it into a 34-page record using a year-old debriefing that he probably shouldn't have trusted because he was by then a man who had run out of disinterested witnesses. All right, let's go back to Major Joop Koyman for a second. He was a little bit more subtle than Mrs. Clements about the whole spy rumors. Per Marsevain's letter reconstruction, Koeman would float the spy idea in conversations with Henk Fernandez, the idea that Marsevain was passing intelligence to The Hague, and then he would immediately wash his hands of it, assuring Fernandez that he personally wanted no part of those rumors. So he'd plant the seed, then deny planting it, step back, plant it again, like Hans Valk leaving a book on the table about coup plotting. The technique is older than counterintelligence itself, and a counterintelligence officer like Marsevain recognized it immediately when he later debriefed the conversations. Now, if you read the campaign against Marsevain in the context of the celebration at Captain Clements had hosted on February 25th, the spy rumors reveals itself for what it was, which is protection. The mission members who had been on the wrong side of Valk's last 6 months in Suriname, who had gone to celebrations that they shouldn't have gone to, they had given advice that they couldn't defend, they had allowed access to places that they can't explain, they needed Bouterse to mistrust the new colonel. If Marsevain had built clean working relationships with the Surinamese leadership, the Surinamese would eventually tell him who had done what. The Vulcaneers needed Bouterse to freeze him out before that conversation could happen. So they fed Bouterse an idea. The new colonel is a spy. The new colonel is not your friend. Don't let him in the room. Bouterse, who is already disposed to mistrust a Dutch counterintelligence officer assigned to monitor him, and he's not exactly thrilled about the institutional message contained in the new mission attaché architecture that we talked about, the two hats, he picked up what was being put down. Briaire would later describe the reversal in the same 1983 to Volkskrant piece where he tells the whole tea ceremony story. Under Valk, Briaire said, Bouterse came to the colonel's office and he left his weapon at the door and he was greeted as an equal, a peer. Under Marsevain, the colonel went to Bouterse's office and he waited in the antechamber, in the reception room. Nice little power play on Bouterse. That's the surface read, but it's a real change. It happened. Marsevain wrote about this in his August 1981 Lamed report, the one that the Dutch state would try to seal until 2060. The reversal of the physical choreography between the head of the Dutch military mission and the head of the Surinamese armed forces was the visible signature of an underlying inversion of power. But that reversal wasn't authored by Bouterse. The reversal was authored by the Dutch officers Marsevain was supposed to be commanding. By the summer of 1980, the Surinamese sergeant class was hearing spy stories and they were acting on it. The Dutch press, when it eventually told the story in 1983, would put a clean Surinamese sergeant quote at the center of it. Sergeant Major Minjals, the National Military Council member, newly powerful and released from prison by that time, is said to have remarked at a meeting that Marsevain was still allowed to attend. And he said, "We don't want him here." So that quote was given to a Dutch reporter named Jos Heymans by military members who had been on the inside of the mission that Marsevain had inherited. It was given to him a week after Vrij Nederland leaked the secret Koenders report, naming those same mission members as the architects of the campaign against their commanding officer. So the mission members weren't telling that reporter what they had done. They were telling him what the Surinamese had done. The mission's spy framing campaign in the version Briaire and Clements offered to Dutch readers in 1983 was that the Surinamese officers themselves already recognized him as a spy. So they were passing the buck a little bit, they'd say in America. Briaire tried claiming that men like Minjals had supposedly already served alongside Marsevain in the Dutch military intelligence, the Sectie, the secret section before the coup. And I searched to see if Chas Minjals had actually served in the secret section of the Dutch military intelligence, because that would be a very interesting find. I couldn't find any archival evidence to support Briaire's claim that Minjals had served in the Dutch military intelligence. So that can't be corroborated with the available record. But what can be corroborated is that Minjals' actual pre-sergeant's coup training had come from a Surinamese civilian Marxist activist, Dr. Lupao Sam, the leftist People's Party, right? So the man that Briaire was trying to claim had served alongside Marsevain in the Dutch Army intelligence had in fact been trained by exactly the kind of figure that Marsevain had spent his whole Lamed career tracking from the other side. So unless Chas Minjals was some secret double agent deep spy who had penetrated the communist party of Suriname, the leftist party, and was feeding information to the intelligence, and that's still under lock and key in some secret archive somewhere, the reading on the face of it seems to imply that he was indeed a leftist sergeant who was more inclined to leftist ideas, and that Briaire had told this story as the only source of that intelligence to try to throw people off the scent, his scent, that they were the ones that were responsible for it. Minjals had his own reasons to mistrust the new Dutch colonel. He was already a radical left sergeant on the junta whose own political program at that time, the Development Army, the politicized revolutionary military, the Cuban Marxist alignment, was already hostile to everything Marsevain's career had been about. Marsevain had spent 12 years at Lamed watching exactly Minjal's kind of movements emerge in Surinamese politics. So the two men's worldviews were incompatible before either of them had ever said a word to each other. What the Valkeneers added was not the spy rumors content. They gave Minjal's instincts some traction, some shoe leather. And Mrs. Clements telling Captain Fernandez and Captain Horb that the new colonel was a spy. And Major Kuhlman telling the same officers the same thing in subtler language. It was just a steady drumbeat of internal mission gossip channeling outward into the Surinamese officer corps. Minjals had his reason. The mission just turned those reasons into a consensus. So this is the trap that Marcevin walked into. Not a trap set by his counterpart, a trap set for his counterpart to spring by his own subordinates. By August of 1980, that trap had already closed. By late summer in 1980, Marcevin knew that something was wrong with the mission. He didn't know how deep it went quite yet. Counterintelligence officers, even the good ones, are working in a fog by definition. They don't see the whole picture. They see kind of the shape of things in the fog. What he could see was that two of his most senior subordinates, Captain Clements and Captain Briaire, were still being read into Dutch security files that they had no operational reason to access. The same Clements who had hosted the post-coup victory party. Marcevin's Lamed colleague, Major Koenders, had come to Paramaribo in the days immediately after the sergeant's coup in February of 1980 to conduct interviews. He had sought out Lieutenant Roy Botza, who had fled the country, but who later told him directly that Hans Valk had urged him to take power. Clement and Briaire had also sat for interviews with Koenders. Both had volunteered to him that they had themselves helped participate in the coup. Now, both men would walk back these statements later, and neither of them would ever be held to account for their actions. The Dutch ambassador had seen Fred Ormskirk's autopsy on his desk by this point in time. He knew the Surinamese Dutch military man had been tortured and killed under the new regime. He knew that his mission had been silent about it. We covered the whole Ormskirk saga in the previous episode. The October 28, 1980 Koenders report on Botza, which would document Valk's pre-coup involvement, was already drafting itself in the same fog Marcevin was now walking into. So Marcevin wasn't deploying into a mission that he had no read on. He was deploying into a mission where his own team was already documenting as compromised. So what matters here is what Marcevin now had to live with two senior subordinate officers in Clements and Briaire who had admitted involvement in the coup that had killed Surinamese citizens who were being briefed on and now covering up a murder, and who were still being fed Dutch security material from Brussels. And I say Brussels because Brussels meant Hans Valk, who had quietly been reassigned to NATO after his recall from Paramaribo. NATO, the very organization whose intelligence apparatus in those years was running the operations that would become later known as or associated with Gladio. So Marcevin wrote that he believed Clements and Briaire were being fed from Valk in his new posting. Now, it wasn't or hasn't been fully provable. That kind of information is something that a careful officer will put in a Nachschrift, an addendum, a note for the record, a piece of paper that you file away when you want the institutional memory to know what you're seeing without putting your whole career on the line by claiming that you can prove it. Kind of a memo or footnote. But documentation, that's the professional response. But things got really worse for Marcevin throughout the fall. Two mission members went over Marcevin's head, formally, in writing, to demand his removal. Two men who had been The men who had been running the spy narrative against him in the Surinamese officer corps were now wiring The Hague to fire him. On March 18, 1981, Major Joop Koeman delivered a strictly personal memorandum to the Dutch ambassador in Paramaribo, Wegelin van Klerenberg, and it was critical of Marcevin's leadership and it directly and personally against him. So the memo was timed to land on the ambassador's hands one day before Wegelin's scheduled meeting with Bouterse, a meeting that Koeman knew was happening. What Marsevain would later learn when he sat down with Koeman to ask him about the memo was that Koeman had previewed 5 of the main points directly with Bouterse the day before submitting it. 12 days later, Major Niche took the military route. On March 30th, 1981, Niche sent an open telegram via official channels, open meaning unsealed, visible to every clerk it passed through, but directly to the Minister of Defense and the Minister of Foreign Affairs in The Hague. And Nice's telegram declared that the mission was no longer functioning. He demanded that the Dutch government explain why it was being so indecisive about executing a commandowisseling, which is like a change of command. So the man who had been Marsevain's number 2 man, who had received Marsevain's confidence over coffee in the late 80s, who had been on the phone with Hans Valk in Brussels checking in on mission policies and politics in real time, he was now wiring the defense ministry to demand his commanding officer's removal. So the mutiny was now on paper. 2 channels, both timed to the spring of 1981 when the mission's collapse was being negotiated with The Hague and the Valkeneers needed to push their preferred outcome, Marsevain out, the mission's Bouterse-aligned arrangement preserved, before the whole clock ran out on them. So around this same time, in a conversation with Major Niche, his deputy, the man Marsevain still believed at this point in time was one of the few mission members that he could trust, the colonel said something that he would later come to regret. And the term was Standrecht, summary military justice, often fatal without trial, and oftentimes for treason or an insubordination. So 2 years later, in the summer of 1983, with the Prompt Commission and their investigation into Valk preparing to launch its inquiry, Captain Briaire would tell the Limburgsch Dagblad the following, quote, "He had told Major Nice that he wanted to have me summarily executed in Suriname." So Briaire and Clements had visited Major Koenders in Apeldoorn earlier, hoping to file a complaint against Marsevain on the strength of that very Standrecht claim. And Koenders advised them not to. He said there's already enough mess, he told them, and there was. So framing the new colonel as an unstable, unhinged man who would shoot his own officers, that storyline, that's where it started, is right here. Whether Marsevain actually said anything that resembled what Briaire was reporting, whether he was just venting in front of the man he thought he could trust, or whether the language was mission internal and then it got exaggerated as it grew in transit, that question doesn't matter. The story circulated, the framing took root. We know that it was Standrecht out of frustration, and Standrecht as a metaphor weaponized against the man who supposedly reached for it. The man whose name would both be associated with actual Standrecht in Suriname's history was Wilfred Hawker, who was actually executed on a stretcher at Fort Zeelandia after the failed Rambocus coup of March 1982. And he was, in March of 1981, still alive. His own first counter-coup attempt was only 12 days away. We'll come back to him. The man whose own state intelligence services would later characterize him as Overspannen, mentally broken, a mental breakdown, with the same dismissive function, that man was Marsevain. So Marsevain, meanwhile, was trying to clean house. He drafted recommendations for the replacement of the dissident corps, Koeman, Nice, Clements, Briaire, Laura, and the 4 members of the Valk-era contingency his 1981 Lamed report would identify by name as the Complotterunda faction. So on the same day that he filed that complaint, he recommended Lieutenant Van Dijk and Sergeant Major Koenders for royal decoration for loyalty. The men he had inherited from the Valk-era, plus the deputy that he had once thought was an exception to the rule, by the time Marsovain drafted those recommendations, he had figured out who Niche was. Marsovain had no way of knowing in early 1981 what would happen to the investigation when it was finished. The investigator was Major Koenders. He was a Lamed counterintelligence officer, and according to at least one article from that period of time from Jos Heymans, he was also Marsovain's subordinate. Either way, the two men had known each other for years. They shared the same Lamed Bureau Suriname portfolio. Marsovain had been the senior counterintelligence specialist at Lamed across the 1970s, the man The Hague had analyzing the monthly reports and tracking the slow accumulation of institutional knowledge. And Koenders has been the man in Paramaribo writing the reports between 1970 and 1972. He had run the S2 Trees in the colony. So by 1981, the Bureau Suriname portfolio was effectively Koenders to inherit. He would, within at least 2 years, be running it. So the Dutch press would later describe Koenders as a tough interviewer. He had an institutional reason to be tough. He was sitting across from the men who had destroyed his mentor's career and sabotaged it by calling him a spy in Suriname. By September 1981, Koenders had finished his report. Classified geheim persoonlijk, strictly personal. The conclusion was unambiguous. Hans Valk's role in the coup was confirmed. Valk had committed breaches of military discipline. The mission members under Valk's command had been aware of the coup before it happened. They hadn't stopped it. The Koenders report was an institutional indictment of Valk-era that Marsovain's own August 31st, 1981 report had been laying the groundwork for. So the man who received Koenders' report at Lamed was Colonel Bram Schulte. So the same Schulte whom Marsovain had been writing his catalog of incidents to on May 5th of 1981, Schulte read the Koenders' report. He took its conclusions seriously enough to want them gone. His instruction, which was recorded later in the Ankraut Dossier, CID 004 archive, would become one of the structurally telling phrases of the entire affair. Berg, Maar, op, file it away. The Koenders report ended up in a drawer. How exactly the Schulte Demmink institution disposed of the findings we covered in episode number 8. What matters for here is that it was on the record in the summer of 1981 before it was filed. Senior members of the Dutch military mission had known about the Bouterse coup before it happened, and they didn't stop it. The Dutch state's own counterintelligence officer, Marsovain's protege, Koenders, had said so in a classified report, and his commanding officer had filed the report away rather than act on it. 8 months later, on June 1st, 1982, Major Koenders would officially become the commander of the 450th Counterintelligence Detachment, which was the unit running Project Fatima. The same intelligence techniques Koenders had used to interrogate the Vulcaners in 1981 became his operational toolkit for infiltrating the Surinamese resistance networks in the Netherlands in 1982, a story we've been building to and telling over the last 2 years. So Marsovain's protege carried the Bureau Suriname portfolio forward. The man who had defended his mentor's legacy in the interrogation rooms in the summer of 1981 would, within the coming months, be running covert ops against the very resistance networks his mentor's career had been all about understanding. That was the mission Marsovain had been sent to clean up. That's what he had walked into, and by the spring of 1981, that was what was finally chasing him out the door. Now, Bouterse heard about the Standrecht. His response on March 11th was direct. The commander-in-chief informed his officers that he intended to dissolve the entire mission if the Netherlands didn't agree to keep Briaire and Clements where they were. Quote, "They can all just go home. Then we won't need a mission at all anymore." The same archival document that records the March 11th statement contains the part that Bouterse said next. For Suriname, he told his officers, the issue wasn't about the removal of these two, it was about the removal of another person. That person was Marsevain himself. The price of removing the dissidents was the mission itself, which is to say that the dissidents made themselves indispensable to the regime that they were not supposed to be cultivating. While all of this was happening inside of the mission, there were dark political clouds circling above Paramaribo that had their own story to tell. The August 13, 1980 arrests of Sital, Minjals, and Joman were not a response to a real coup plot. They were a political maneuver. And we know this because we have André Haakmat's account of how it was set up in his own memoir. So on the night of August 12, 1980, Bouterse came unannounced to the Prime Minister Henk Chinnasen and the lawyer Chinnasen had brought from the Netherlands as his senior political advisor, which was André Haakmat. He would soon be the vice premier. But Bouterse didn't come alone. He brought his garrison commander and his main enforcer, Major Roy Horp. Bouterse told them there was a, quote, serious development going on. Sergeant Sital, Minjals, and Yeoman, he said, were planning to stage a coup very soon with the support of a foreign power, Cuba. Action was required now. He needed their permission. Haakmat and Chinnasen hesitated. They asked Bouterse for concrete evidence. Bouterse answered in 2 words, no doubt. To seal the trap, Bouterse offered a terrifying level of specificity. He claimed the leftists had finalized their plans the night before in room 9 of the Hotel Riverview in Leonsburg, backed by a foreign power. He even allowed Haakmat a brief, calculated glance at a file of military intelligence reports. Then he framed the choice. If they arrested the 3 men immediately, Bouterse said, the men could stay alive. If they waited until the action started, the military would have to eliminate them to prevent a massacre. For many, this storyline will sound eerily familiar to what Bouterse said at the December murders. Haakmat agreed. They would declare a state of emergency. The action time was set for 6 a.m. the following morning, August 13th. They thought 3 men would be arrested, but the list kept getting longer and longer. By the time they asked what was going on, the operation was already underway and there was no room for discussion. The final tally was 36 names on the list. Lieutenant Surrender Rambocus and Jeff Wert were on the list of those who were to be imprisoned. They were right-wing officers with no link to the Sital faction or to Cuba. Haakmat ended up confronting Bouterse directly, pointing out that Rambocus and Wert had nothing to do with the leftists. Bouterse didn't blink. That still needs to be investigated, the commander replied. But moreover, they were wrongly not prosecuted last time. The left-wing conspiracy was just a smokescreen. Bouterse was cleaning house. The constitutional wreckage followed immediately. Parliament was dissolved, the constitution was suspended, President Johan Ferrier was deposed, and it was Haakmat himself who sat down and drafted the official decrees to finalize the dismissal. Chinnasen was elevated from prime minister to president. Realizing the trap that he had just helped build, Haakmat suddenly tried to back out. Bouterse wouldn't let him. But we agreed to this, Bouterse told him. Instead, the commander handed Haakmat a promotion, real power, making him vice premier and loading him up with portfolios for justice and foreign affairs and police and army. So when Haakmat protested that it was impossible for one man to manage it all, Bouterse just smiled. "You can handle it," he said. Haakmat would later write plainly that he and Chinna Sen, then prime minister, soon to be president, had been tricked by Bouterse into giving permission for the arrest under that pressure. What Haakmat and Chinna Sen did not yet realize was the true price to be paid for that agreement. By authorizing Bouterse to move against his rivals, they were handing him a mandate to suspend the constitution and dissolve parliament and force the resignation of the president. They thought they were just preventing a coup. In all reality, they had just legalized one. The arrest went forward on August 13th, and Bouterse declared a state of emergency, suspended the constitution, and dissolved parliament on the same day. Sitals, Minjals, and Jomen went to Santa Boma prison. The Dutch press registered the move as a rightward shift, a moderate faction in Bouterse consolidating against the radical leftists. Bouterse called it a cleansing of the ultra-left elements and bought himself 8 months of useful support from The Hague and Washington as the moderate who could work with them. The Dutch Communist Party daily newspaper, De Waarheid, would later refer to Bouterse in plain language. Bouterse, until now, had been seen as right-wing. So this is the moment here that we're looking at, where everything is about to change. Then, in the days that follow, the evidence against the three yeoman Minjal Sital began to look pretty thin. Haakmat, who acting as the Minister of Justice, repeatedly asked Bouterse to hand over the official police reports about the meeting so a formal prosecution could begin. The military leadership's failure to provide any real information to the public quickly started to raise suspicions, in Haakmat's own assessment that they were purely political detention arrests with no real coup behind them. When Bouterse finally delivered the reports a week late, Haakmat saw what the case actually rested upon. It was a single informant, John Harjoperitno, a fellow National Military Council sergeant, had flown to Managua with Sital in July of 1980 for the first anniversary of the Nicaraguan independence, for the first anniversary of the Nicaraguan Revolution. There was Yasser Arafat was in Managua that week, and Castro was on a week-long tour of Nicaragua centered on the anniversary rally. In Harjoperitno, his trip report claimed that Sital had met privately with them both and that Castro had explicitly pledged support for a takeover, one that would include liquidating Bouterse and the existing civilian government of bourgeois leaders. That was the entirety of the case against them. One officer's trip report, Harjoperitno's, was Bouterse's mole. He had been instructed to play along and to report back the entire trip. But he was more than just a spy. This was the same John Harjoperitno who Virginia Hoffman, who we talked about in the last episode about Fred Ormskirk, she claimed that he was the one who left the door to the prison cell open so he could enjoy the final and fatal torture of Fred Ormskirk alongside her. And this was the same Harjoperitno as journalist Rudy Keka documented, and the victim himself later testified, stood alongside Roy Horb and beat ex-officer Jeff Vert, who was now back in prison, with 4 or 5 different bull tendons. The regime had suspended a national constitution based on the word of its own butcher. André Haakmat and the public prosecutor's office reviewed the file. The case rested entirely on Harjoperitno's claims with nothing else to back them up. Haakmat would later say, with the bluntness of a man who had read the file, that he was fully convinced Sital, Minjals, and Jomen would be acquitted because there was no evidence against them. It was a very loose and flimsy case. He had reason to expect that the system would work that way. Across the summer and the fall of 1980, Haakmat had been building Suriname's new architecture, specifically designed to constrain the military power with the rule of law. He had personally drafted the special jurisdiction decree and proclaimed on September 8, 1980, establishing a bijzondere rechtshof, a special court comprised of mixed civilian and military judges, to try these corruption cases. Civilian institutional restraint to balance out the military by design. But the problem was the case did not stay where the existing law would have normally sent it. Sital, Minjals, and Jomin objected to being tried before a single civilian magistrate that was beneath their honor as military men. They said. Their lawyers, Baburam, Hoost, and Supersat, and Redevalt went to Haakmat and asked him to amend the law by decree so that the case could go to the Krijgskrant. I hope I got that one right. Which was where a civilian president would sit alongside two military associate judges in a collegiate tribunal. So Haakmat agreed, and he issued the decree, and the case went to that court. Now, the Krijgskrant's regular president was Mr. F. Ramdat Missier. Now, Missier had a big problem because convicting Sital and his group, Haakmat would later write, would make Missier's position within the Surinamese Hindustani community really problematic because Sital, Minjals, and Jomin were popular figures across the political left, and Missier, a Hindustani jurist with plans for a future life in Surinamese public life, did not want his name attached to their conviction. So he found a way to weasel out of it. A few weeks earlier, Haakmat had asked Missier to travel to the Netherlands on a service assignment to kind of recruit more judges and prosecutors because Suriname was very understaffed at this time. And Missier informed Haakmat that the Netherlands trip would have to happen now, during the trial, or Missier could no longer be interested. Convenient. So Haakmat understood the maneuver, but he granted the request anyway. Missier flew to the Netherlands. The acting president of the Krijgsraad, Professor Valdijk, a Court of Justice member and University of Suriname professor of criminal law, he presided over the Sital, Minjals, and Jomin trial instead. So what Missier was avoiding, Valdijk now had. And the trial went forward, and the defense attorney Eddie Hoos cross-examined the prosecution's key witnesses, almost certainly Harjaparitno, and he concluded by telling the bench, in Haakmat's verbatim recollection, "Mr. President, I refrain from further questioning this witness who is now on the verge of perjury." Sital himself addressed Harjaparitno from the dock. "You are telling lies and committing treason because you think it will earn you a promotion. However, we are fighting for an army without ranks and stars where there will be no place for you." The military prosecutor was Ramnavansh, who served simultaneously as military and public prosecutor. Ramnavansh, in Haakmat's letter phrasing, delivered a pretty skillful closing argument despite how thin the case's evidence was. So when the court ruled in December of 1980, the civilian justice system folded like a tent. One minor co-defendant was acquitted. The primary targets were not. The civilian judge, the substitute, agreed with the two military associate judges who said to convict. Sital and Minjals got 2 years. Jomin got 1 year. So Haakmat's new legal system hadn't failed, at least not precisely. It had been circumvented. The defendants, with Haakmat's own decree in their hand, redirected cases to the Krijgsraad. And the Krijgsraad regular president, he arranged to be in the Netherlands. He was absent. And the substitute civilian judge, he delivered the verdict. So you had 3 layers of people, institutions evading a single trial. The men Haakmat designed his special court to constrain the military, never had to walk into the courtroom Haakmat had designed. Ramdat Misir's reward came 14 months later. In February of 1982, Bouterse forced Chinnasend out. The civilian leadership, Haakmat, Valdik, proposed that Misir, then acting president of the Court of Justice, he be the caretaker president up until the elections. Bouterse accepted. The same Misir who had ducked the Sital case in December, the same Misir who would, as we will see shortly, convict Wilfred Hawker of an alleged coup, the same Misir who, 10 months after he was installed as president, would be the head of state during the night of the December murders at Fort Zeelandia. The pattern that began with a Netherlands service assignment trip ended with him becoming president. As for the Cuban invasion or alleged invasion, the Cuban side never confirmed Castro's pledge to overthrow Bouterse, and on Bouterse's own state-level visit to Havana months later in May of 1981, 15 months after taking power with his foreign minister Harvey Narendorp at his side and Castro in the Cuban Politburo, across the Oval Table, Castro told them the opposite of what Harjaparitno's testimony claimed Castro had told Sital. So Castro actually counseled them against a socialist alignment. He said, quote, "Your revolution has no party or movement that a majority can identify with. You are not a socialist country," Castro told them. "You have only just become an independent country, but you are not yet a nation. My question is, what is your need to want to profile yourself as a country? None. Certainly not as a socialist country." So Castro acknowledged the Dutch relationship pointedly. The Netherlands, he said, was one of the few countries that had not been afraid to work with Cuba, and he was grateful for it. Bouterse heard this in person, and he had a witness, the foreign minister he had brought with him, who would later record the conversation in his memoirs a year later. So the Sital prosecution file rested on Harjaparitno's testimony alone. Castro himself, when given the chance, said something completely different. The Dutch press, when it later ran the Sital story, they would frame the offense as Sital boasting about his trip. The prosecution file framed it differently. What had actually angered Bouterse in his own eyes was that one of his own National Military Council members was running his own foreign policy at a head of state level without permission, and had, on the report of a fellow officer who happened to be Bouterse's informant, accepted a foreign leader's offer to remove him. It's important to remember here, think about how Sital saw the military. It was, in the Cuban model, it was a people's army, right? There was no rank and file and hierarchy. So he's thinking, why shouldn't I be able to talk to a Castro or to a Maurice Bishop? It's all the same level, right? Bouterse still sees things in terms of power rankings and dynamics. So when he watches a Sital acting as if there's no rank, and he's seeing himself using rank to give people rewards and goodies and things like this, it's a direct challenge to the power structure. You're getting these things coming at heads. So this is what triggered him around August 13th, or rather, that is the file Bouterse produced a week after he had already arrested the men to backfill in what he had told Haakmat the night before. And there's one more thing about the August 13th sequence that is important to notice. On the same day that Bouterse arrested the radical left sergeants, he simultaneously arrested First Lieutenant Surrender Rambocus. And Rambocus is no leftist. He had been the leader of the rival Zandere office group that had planned its own coup. Bouterse had been part of his group originally with Jeff Vert. So He had been the leader of the rival Zandere officers group who had planned its own coup before the sergeant's coup for July of 1980, before Bouterse preempted them. Bouterse had abandoned their group and joined a different group. And that Zandere group had Jeff Vert in it, who Horb and Harja Baritno would torture with the bull tendons while Bouterse watched. So he had clashed, Rambocus had clashed with Bouterse's authoritarianism throughout 1980, and from the moderate democratic side of things. He had no Cital, Castro, Managua trip on his record. He had no association with the radical faction. He showed up at the barracks on the morning of August 13 voluntarily, and in response to a summon, he was immediately taken into custody with no charge or interrogation. His family would later document this pattern of harassment in a formal letter that was written in October of 1980. Bouterse's cleansing of the ultra-left elements had purged his most capable rival on the moderate democratic side of things at the same time. The pretext or the cover story was a Cuban plot, but the operation was the removal of every officer in the Suriname army who could plausibly stand up to Bouterse from any direction. The radical left and the moderate democratic right in the same operation under the same cover story of the state of emergency. The press in Paramaribo and The Hague registered the arrest of Cital, Minjals, and Yeoman as a rightward shift. The arrest of Rambocus didn't fit the bill at all, and so it didn't get the same coverage. Rambocus's name would return to the story in March of 1982 when his attempted counter-coup against Bouterse would fail, and Sergeant Wilfred Hawker, who was already wounded and lying on a hospital bed, would be lifted from the bed by soldiers and shot by a firing squad in the courtyard of Fort Zeelandia. So the seed for that later day, that murder of Hawker, was planted not in August of 1980, but in a few months after, in a conversation Bouterse had with Haakmat that we know of because André Haakmat eventually wrote it down. After the December 1980 conviction, when the Cital and his group were filing appeals, Bouterse came back to Haakmat with a follow-up request. He didn't actually want the appeal to proceed. Instead, he wanted Cital, Minjals, and Yeoman to die in a prisoner transport. He already had a willing driver and a vehicle and a ravine all laid out. It would look like an accident. He had the man already, he told Haakmat, who was a gray-haired man in his 50s who was waiting below, willing to die at the wheel for the operation. Haakmat refused. He told Bouterse that the president had to be involved and that Chinasen would resign if anything happened. Bouterse eventually backed down. 14 months after that conversation, when Wilfred Hawker was lifted from his hospital bed and shot at Fort Zeelandia, Bouterse no longer needed Haakmat's permission or Chinasen, who was gone by then. The man who had asked for the staged accident in 1980 had, by March of 1982, become the man who didn't ask anymore. Not long after that, Peter Maar would die in a suspicious car accident. So this is the man that The Hague and Washington were calling the moderate choice. So remember this when Major Hank Fernandez dies in a very suspicious helicopter crash some months later. There's one more piece of context to this. You remember how in the previous episode, in the months before their arrest, the radical left faction of Cital and Yeoman and Minjals, they had attempted to seize, and they were likely going to kill because they were going to accuse him of treason, which would be a capital offense, Lieutenant Michel Van Rey, who was the Minister of Defense and Police in Chinasen's civilian government. So Cital had brought the military unit, the YP-408, the Panzer tank, and surrounded Chinasen's house during the standoff. Now, Bouterse intervened, took the moderate position, and negotiated Van Rey's safe extraction out of the country with the Dutch embassy's logistical support. Wegelin and Haakmat had prearranged the embassy's refuge, and Bouterse personally guaranteed Van Rey's safe passage to the airport. Van Rey was on a plane on May 27, 1980, and episode 9 covers that whole sequence. But for the purposes of August 1980, what matters is that Bouterse had spent these 3 previous months earning equity, building up the moderate brokering position that August 13th would let him spend. What we didn't cover in the Handler episode was in that exact same August, while the American ambassador in Paramaribo was cabling home reassurances about how Bouterse was the manageable one, the controllable one, Mrs. Clements was at her army reception telling Captain Horb and Major Fernandez that Dutch colonel was a spy. 2 different machines were running and they looked unrelated, but they weren't. The political right turn, the suppression of the Sital faction, the rescue of Van Rey from that same faction in May, the public posture of a moderate Bouterse brokering between civilian and the military, the private request to murder his prisoners, brought the Dutch state and the American embassy temporary calm, at least at a policy level. It also bought the dissident wing of the Dutch mission some permanent cover at the operational level. As long as Bouterse was acceptable to The Hague and the mission was Bouterse's preferred channel, no one in The Hague was going to look too closely at just how the mission had ended up that way. The man whose job it was to look closely was Marsevain, which is why he had to be neutralized. In January 1981, the machinery turned once again. The most powerful man in Suriname after Bouterse himself was by then André Haakmat. Foreign affairs, justice, army and police, a super ministerial portfolio. Haakmat held 3 of the most consequential cabinet positions simultaneously. He was also, in spite of his 1970s radical background, by this point in time in his career, he was technically just a moderate. A Western-educated lawyer playing the constitutional restoration card. Objectively, he was the man who was keeping the military in the barracks and the civilian transition on track. But President Henk Chinassen had started to hate his old friend. The 2 men were locked in a bitter power struggle, with Haakmat actively trying to sideline the president into a ceremonial role. Chinassen was looking for a weapon to use against his super minister. And in the first days of January, the Dutch Internal Security Service, the BVD, delivered a several hundred-page dossier on Haakmat into the hands of both Chinassen and the Bouterse's military command. Its central charge against Haakmat was that he was the communist threat and that he was pro-Russian because he had visited a Soviet youth kolkhoz years earlier when he was a student. They said he was pro-Chinese because he had traveled abroad to East Asia in his university days. The framing read on its face like your standard Cold War security briefing, but it was not. It was a hit piece. Vrij Nederlands reporters Elma Verge and Gerard van Westerlo would later trace the use the Dutch ambassador made of the dossier. So Wegelin, the same outgoing ambassador who in June of 1980 had refused to shake Valk's hand and warned Marsevain that he wouldn't be shielded anymore, he had been operating for months on the framework that Suriname, under Haakmat, was sliding toward what he called Phase 1 of the Cuba scenario. Pretty much the Dutch ambassador's analysis of the situation was that if Haakmat was in cabinet, that meant that Cuba was in Paramaribo. And Cuba and Paramaribo meant a Caribbean leftward app. If you had a Caribbean leftward app, meant that the United States would expect the Netherlands to do something about it before they had to do something about it themselves. So the BVD dossier was the lever. On January 4th, 1981, Chinassen confronted Bouterse. Either Haakmat goes, the president said, or I do. Haakmat went. Within days, he was ruled out of the cabinet, replaced in the security portfolio by Harvey Narendorp. Now, read what Harvey Narendorp did in his first weeks in office. He lifted the visa restrictions on Cuban nationals. By February 1981, 6 weeks after Haakmat's removal as the communist threat, the cultural delegation from Havana was in Paramaribo for the first anniversary celebration of the coup. By June of 1981, Cuba would open an official mission in Suriname. The Dutch Security Service had run an operation to remove a Western-educated moderate constitutional lawyer from the Surinamese cabinet on the grounds that his presence created a Cuba risk, and the man who replaced him was the man who actively imported Cuba relationships the operation had claimed to be trying to prevent. Make sense of that what you will. Which is ultimately to say that the BVD's January 1981 dossier on Haakmat was either a profound failure of analytic tradecraft or it was something entirely different. You can decide which one. The Dutch embassy had burned the only moderate keeping the military in the barracks, all because, in the words of a Dutch embassy colleague who would later use this against Wegelin's intervention, quote, "It was not pleasant to hear the super minister speak anti-Dutch. That did not make him pro-Cuban." So the Dutch claimed they were trying to stop Cuba from gaining influence, but their actions actually put the person in charge who welcomed Cuba with open arms, even though he himself would say he was not pro-Cuba. This matters for our man Marsevain. By late January 1981, the same Dutch system that had caused Narendorp problem was also causing trouble within Marsevain's military group. The government was following the same messy logic in two different ways. On the political track, they made a helpful leader look like a communist threat just to get him out of the way. And on the personnel track, they made a good officer like Marsevain look like a spy just to protect corrupt workers who were breaking the rules. As Marsevain sat at his desk in January of 1981, he didn't know the whole story yet. He couldn't tell his mission was falling apart. He saw reports on his own captains getting drunk and teaming up with local officers to plot against him. He could see that the political situation was getting dangerous. What he couldn't see yet was that the same government leaders were behind both problems. The system chose to give in to a dictator and ignore the rebels rather than support the men who were actually trying to stop them. By the late winter of 1981, Suriname was a country that was breathing strangely. The case against the three left faction sergeants, Sital, Minjals, and Joman, had been dragging through the Surinamese military courts for months. Their appeal was scheduled for late February 1981, 6 months of pre-detention, a military court conviction, and an appellate hearing that, according to the correspondence reporting from Paramaribo, was increasingly likely to get reversed on the evidence. The soldiers inside the barracks had stopped believing the story about a Cuban-backed counter-coup. The trade union leaders had stopped believing it. The wives and girlfriends of Sital, Minjals, and Joman had started waging a silent psychological war against the regime, showing up uninvited at official ceremonies dressed entirely in black with symbolic red armbands. And when the regime tried to celebrate the first anniversary of the sergeant's coup in the revolution on February 25th, the event collapsed into a massive student protest. So the pressure was suffocating, and then shortly before the appeal was scheduled to be heard, the defense attorneys abruptly withdrew it. Then, on March 5th, 1981, 5 months after Bouterse had jailed them as a Cuban-backed conspiracy, the same commander went to their cells and negotiated a new political agreement. And he did it the same way that he had jailed them, by going around the civilian government, President Henk Sen and the Council of Ministers were not consulted. Bouterse struck the deal, physically released the men, and pinned officer insignias on their uniform. The civilian government that nominally held authority over the prison system had found out the way that the Dutch press would find out when Bouterse held a press conference the following day with the three men sitting next to him on the dais. The release was negotiated, not granted. Sital, Minjals, and Jomen refused a pardon, which would have implied that they were guilty of something, and they held out for amnesty, which implied no guilt and no admission of wrong. The Dutch journalist Ad Kamsteg, interviewing De Jong in the immediate aftermath, captured Sital's leverage in a single sentence. Yes, but when I get out and reconcile with Bouterse, a great deal will have to change here. De Jong's contemporaneous read of the dynamic was that Bouterse had been forced to the table by the public pressure mobilized by the wives of the convicted soldiers who showed up with the red armbands at the regime's first anniversary reception. Sital came back to the regime stronger than the man who had jailed him. The next day, he held a press conference and announced what the entire previous 8 months of Western diplomatic reassurance had been built to prevent. Quote, "There will certainly be a shift in the totality of the country. The revolutionary process will pave the way for a socialist society." He went further. "It is now time to explain what we want to achieve with the revolution. We all strive for a socialist society in which there is work for all, in which social justice prevails, and in which no longer knows exploitation, racism, or oppression." Sital, Minjals, Jomen, they all sat next to him on the dais. They were in uniform. They wore no insignia on their epaulets, not even those of their original rank. The army that had stripped them of their rank was now reinstating them as the vanguard of a constitutional revolution. Bouterse called them his brothers in arms and comrades. When asked what the role the three would now play, his answer was direct: in the vanguard of the revolution. What's worth pausing on here before we move on to what happened next in March is the room that the press conference was actually happening in. The Civilian Council of Ministers, the President's Cabinet, the constitutional government of Suriname, was not at the press conference. They were not informed in advance that the press conference was even happening. They learned the country had shifted to a socialist course from the same Dutch press wires that went out to the rest of the world. So within hours of the announcement, they convened their own emergency meeting, the Spoedberaad, the crisis convocation. When asked at the press conference whether the civilian government had been informed of the line he was announcing, Bouterse answered, "This is strictly a military matter. We will provide the government with information because we govern in close consultation with the government." So the man who had spent 8 months performing moderation for The Hague and Washington had just used a press conference to announce, without telling his civilian government, that the country was switching constitutional tracks. Ruud de Wit, writing from Paramaribo for Nieuwsblad van het Noorden, called the release sensational and reached for a Dutch expression to explain it: a cat in distress making strange leaps. A country that had spent a year being twisted in different directions by handlers it didn't fully understand was now starting to thrash about. This was not a conversation. This was a rescue operation. Bouterse absorbed the men who were about to destroy him by making their survival dependent on his own. Sital, who had spent 7 months in Fort Zeelandia on Bouterse's orders, now needed Bouterse alive to protect his rehabilitation. Minjals, fresh out of the dungeon, went straight to the Dutch press to warn that given the developments surrounding Cuba and Nicaragua, one would have to be naive not to expect agitation against us. So this wasn't independent commentary. This was Sital's block, the voice of its sharpest tongue, planting a flag. We are now the regime's left flank, and the regime is ours. The left part was handled. The right was a harder problem, and it was building in the barracks where the Dutch could not easily see it. Marsevain was not the only one paying attention to where things were headed. On Sophie Redmondstraat, in the Chinese quarter of Paramaribo, storefronts packed cheek to cheek, street signs painted across wooden facades, goldsmiths and silversmiths doing steady trade. The same math was running much more quietly. The Chinese community had been in Suriname across multiple generations. Some had arrived as contract laborers in the 19th century. Others had followed commerce wherever it led. But by 1980, they controlled most of Suriname's retail trade. And Bouterse's government was strangling it. Permits were expiring. New ones were not being issued. Quote, "The climate for doing business has not improved under the new rulers," a community spokesman told the Haakmat Mijn Dagblad in 1981 of March, which, in the compressed language of a community that had survived by not making enemies, was about as close as you will hear to outward dissent. So some of them had stopped waiting. There, 3 Chinese businessmen, a disco bar owner, a man who ran a chain of shops, and an operator of a bar with a brothel in downtown Paramaribo had allegedly begun financing a military solution to the problem. Others were setting up an actual lottery for Chinese people who wanted to bet money on the date of the next coup. Marsevain was busy documenting all of this, the political temperature, the business community's desperation, the soldiers who had given everything to the 1980 coup and they felt like they had received nothing in return. Men like Sergeant Major Wilfred Hawker. Hawker was one of the original 16 who had overthrown the civilian government. He had just returned from advanced training with the Dutch Commando Corps, and he was now running the paratrooper training for Suriname's special units. But while his former comrades were taking over ministries and moving into villas, Hawker was still sleeping in the barracks, and he confronted Bouterse directly, complaining he hadn't made any personal gains from the revolution. He was an elite soldier feeling completely sidelined. Quote, "He harbored grudges against the new regime," his paratrooper instructor reported afterwards. You could actually sense that something was going to happen. So Hawker was a very particular kind of problem, and Marsevain was equipped to recognize him. Unlike Bouterse and Horb, he had been denied officer promotion despite his role in the 1980 takeover. He was known as Mr. Driller and Bickle, just like Fred Ormskirk, the toughest commando in the army, but deemed in the military leadership's own phrase, they called him a stupid brave man which first shoots and then kills. And he was furious about it. He was furious that he was still sleeping in the barracks, and he was enraged that the radical leftists Bouterse had just let out of prison were being handed government ministries. Somewhere in the preceding weeks, the Volkskrant would never specify when, Hawker had parked a military vehicle in front of Bouterse's office and refused to move it until he got himself a meeting. He got a private conversation whose contents in the Volkskrant's careful phrasing never leaked out in Paramaribo. Whatever Hawker said in that room, Bouterse heard it loud and clear. Whatever Bouterse heard, he decided could not be allowed to keep walking around Paramaribo. 10 days after the release of the leftists, on the afternoon of March 15, 1981, a Dutch citizen who we only know by his initials was driving a pickup truck along the Carnezoenspad outside of Paramaribo, just past kilometer marker 28, when he was passed by a car containing Wilfred Hawker and Private Weissenbroek. The road was quiet. He had a friend in his cab with him. A car passed his pickup, traveling fast in the same direction. Then a second car overtook them both. It was a beige Mazda 929, a new model. The witness, whose initials are NH, who was a Dutchman who lived in Paramaribo for some years, saw inside it, quote, a light-colored male with a white cap on his hat. Now, the Mazda pulled alongside the first car. Then there were 8 to 10 shots. Forensics later determined that the weapon was an Uzi submachine gun. The first car, the one that had passed NH's pickup a moment earlier, went into the ditch. The Mazda paused for about 10 seconds, then drove away with screeching tires. Inside that first car was Lieutenant Wilfred Hawker, the Surinamese officer who had thrown in with the radical sergeants and then thrown back out, and Soldier Weissenbroek. Now, NH, the witness, with some help of some bystanders, got Hawker into his pickup. Weissenbroek was already dead. Hawker was shot in the chest, in the neck, and bubbles were coming from his throat. His head was on a burlap sack on NH's lap when he asked, "Am I going to die?" "Don't talk," said NH. "You're not going to die. It takes more than that." That was his answer. NH would later describe him in a conversation with historian Ellen de Vries as having looked tough and startled in the same moment. The composure of a man performing a role for a dying man. Hawker had asked Surinamese military police for protection earlier that week. He had told them in so many words, "Otherwise, I will be shot." So he had seen this coming. The MP did not protect him. After the shooting, from the military hospital, NH would call the MP duty officer himself. He was right about that part. Bouterse arrived at the academic hospital fairly quickly the following morning, as the newspaper put it, to find out what his prisoner was prepared to say. The next day's Hefre of Volk reported killing as the gunfight between two parties, both armed, both shooting. That was the story. Neither half of that sentence was true. Sergeant Wilfred Hawker and Private Weissenbroek were dressed in track suits and unarmed. They were ambushed by a third vehicle whose occupants fired an Uzi openly into their car. There was no exchange. There was an execution. This, though, was the public framing of things. It was also the framing that Marsevain's own mission, sitting on a completely different set of facts from their local eyewitnesses, accepted in silence. 2.5 years later, in 1983, Vrij Nederland would publish the secret report by Major Koenders, compiled in September of 1981, about what had been really happening inside the Dutch mission from 1980 to 81. Citing witnesses gathered for that investigation, Verhey and Van Westerlo would write that some of the witnesses described the Hawker shooting not as a coup attempt at all, but as a, quote, simple assassination attempt with a drug background. So this drug background wasn't pure speculation, because in October of 1981, 7 months after that Hawker ambush, the Surinamese journalist Briaire published Terror op uitkijk, Terror on the Lookout. And he went undercover as a army photographer exposing Sergeant Lachman's killing of the farmer Deta Mahest and the military police's cover-up. And Berg documented how the murder had been disguised as a drug deal gone bad and named the soldiers who were responsible for it. Sergeant Hans Hemraj Lachman would be sentenced for misconduct by the military tribunal in early 1982. The institutional pattern that Vrij Nederland witnesses were describing in 1983, political killings disguised as drug cover stories, was the same after Briaire's book was published. On December 1982, Bouterse's regime murdered Briaire at Fort Zeelandia along with 14 other men. Now, the drug framing is contested. Ellen de Vries' 2023 reconstruction of the Hawker case, drawn from the same archival files, provides a different reading on what happened. Bouterse purging a rival who had grown dangerous. She doesn't mention the drugs. So whether the witnesses in Vrij Nederland, who were citing in 1983, had it right about the drugs, or whether their handlers had it right, whether De Vries Bouterse purges the rival reading of the story is better fitting of the documentary record, those two readings are not necessarily incompatible. Any regime that would murder Briaire for exposing its drug cover-up would have no difficulty using that same apparatus to dispose of a military rival like Wilfred Hawker. What's still being argued is which version of the killings belongs in the record. What's not being argued is what the mission did about it. The Bouterse account of the Hawker killing, a coup attempt foiled by alert security forces, lawful response, does not match what Marsevain's witnesses had seen. The mission, though, accepted it. Anyway, the mission did not contradict the public framing and Het Vrij Volk. The mission did not push back through any diplomatic channels. Why? Because Valk had made the mission complicit in the February 80 sergeant's coup. The cover that the mission had given him on the night of the coup at Captain Clement's home, the celebration, the advice, the open armory, the fixing of the tanks, it was leverage that Bouterse could hold over them. As long as the mission's role was buried, the mission was compromised and was usable. The moment any mission member pushed back on Bouterse's account of any major event, the mission's own role in the February 1980 coup came back into play. It was mutual blackmail. The mission knew, Bouterse knew the mission knew Bouterse knew, and so the mission accepted whatever Bouterse gave them, and Bouterse left the mission's role in February 1980 in the drawer where the mission had put it. This was the second time this had happened in less than a year. Only 11 months earlier, in May of 1980, the Surinamese army had tortured Fred Ormskirk to death in the Memrabuku barracks. This was the government's first political murder. The Dutch military mission knew about it. Their man in Paramaribo, Marsevain, even had the secret medical autopsy to prove it. However, the mission didn't complain, and the Dutch government in The Hague chose to ignore the killing. They did this because the United States had told them to stay friendly with the leaders in Suriname to keep Cuba from gaining influence on them. Until the Dutch ambassador blew up that option with the Haakmat BVD dossier. Staying quiet on Hawker wasn't a one-time mistake. It was part of the new regular habit of looking the other way. Because of the threat of blackmail, they felt that they couldn't tell the truth. Hawker survived the ambush. He was court-martialed in October of 1981. The presiding judge, Mr. Ramdat Missier, the same Ramdat Missier who had dodged the Sital case 14 months earlier, now back on the Kriegsgrad to preside over the Hawker case, the man Bouterse would name as Chinnasen's replacement after he forced the president out 4 months later. The defense was Eddie Hoost. Hawker, on the stand, said his coup statements had been given under duress during police questioning. What he had actually wanted, he said, was just to purge the Army's senior leadership, clean it of officers who had lost the confidence of the rank and file, not to shoot them out. Ramdat Missier did not credit the testimony. 4 years for conspiracy against legitimate authority. Hawker would not serve those 4 years. In March of 1982, after a failed coup against Bouterse, mounted by another army officer, Surrender Rambokas, Hawker, already wounded and lying on a stretcher, would be lifted from the bed by the soldiers, transported to Fort Zeelandia, and would be shot by a firing squad in the courtyard. Standrecht, applied in earnest. Marcevain's frustrated remark to Major Nees the previous winter would, in a different person's mouth and a different time, become policy. But that's another year ahead. We're still in March of 1981, and there is one more piece to the March story. In the days following the Hawker ambush, the Surinamese press began naming a man who supposedly betrayed him to Bouterse, a close military friend, someone in the officer corps, the kind of man that Hawker would have trusted with his coup plan if he had had one. That man was Sergeant 3rd Class Arthi Gore. Hawker and his close friend, Arthi Gore, were, between the two of them, the entire commando capability of the Surinamese army. Gore was the only active duty commando in the country. Hawker, his training partner in Roosendaal the previous summer, was now running the commando training program itself. Suriname's paratrooper instructor, the man who would train the next generation. Bouterse had attempted the same Roosendaal course, but he had washed out and dropped out. By March of 1981, the two most operationally capable soldiers in Suriname were a matched pair, trained together, serving together, increasingly skeptical together, and the man at the top of the army had neither the training nor the credibility inside the barracks. Hawker alone was a threat. Hawker and Gore together were Suriname's only commando force. On Monday, March 18th, the Algemeen Dagblad ran a front-page photograph of Sergeant Arthi Gore in uniform, beret tilted alongside a subheading identifying him as the man who betrayed Hawker's plan to army leadership well over a week ago. The same article reported in the next breath that Gore had denied the accusation to friends the day before. So you have the accusation and the denial, same day, same article. Just think about what that claim meant for Gore. His name had been published as the man who had betrayed Wilfred Hawker to the army leadership. He was Judas Iscariot. And whether he was the actual informer or whether he had been burned tactically by a regime that needed to explain its intelligence, or had simply been named because Bouterse had reached for some convenient face from the group of 16, it didn't matter. The effect was identical. Gore was finished inside of the only community that could have supported another coup attempt. The commandos, who had all sworn an oath with him the night before the sergeant's coup, with their hand on a Bible, loaded their shotguns in their air rifles, and crawled through a wire fence at the munitions bunker, they would never fully trust him again. The only person who could now protect Gore from the men he had sworn an oath with, the men who now saw him as a rat, was the man, Bouterse, who had just outed him. So that was the trap, and it closed without a shot being fired at Gore. A year later, when Hawker would lie wounded in Paramaribo hospital bed and Sergeant Gore would walk into the room as a part of the failed Rambocus coup that had briefly freed Hawker before everything collapsed, the newspaper would publish a retrospective by Karl Boghain under the headline Hawker on Repeat. Boghain simply reminded the readers what his own paper had reported the year before, that Bouterse had named Gore as Hawker's betrayer in 1981, and that Gore had denied it at the time, and that Gore had turned on Hawker once again during the Rambocus coup. As for the Dutch press, in 1981, it had did its job. The accusation reached print, the denial reached the print, and the framing of who had betrayed whom was on the public record. What was not on the public record, what the mission knew but did not say, was the question of what the framing was for. Public spectacle of betrayal? Private mechanism of containment? The same architecture, the same on the Suriname side that the Dutch military mission was running on the Dutch side. The same hand on multiple wheels. By late March of 1981, Marsevain knew. Now, he might not have known everything. I don't know whether he knew about the BVD dossier on Haakmat in January or how much of the hawker drug claims were true, or the depth of which the betrayal of the Valkeners inside his own staff was. But he knew enough of the shape of the thing to know what it was, even if he couldn't see the whole thing. So he did the only thing that a professional could do. He wrote it all down. Marsevain preserved the hawker testimony. It remains filed in the professional records in the Netherlands Institute of Military History under Eco Documenta Collection 610s through 612. He reported it on up the chain despite knowing that it would place the Dutch military mission in a dangerous diplomatic position. Because this wasn't just political analysis anymore. This was a documented war crime. But the political analysis sat under it, and he understood that too. 10 days, one operation. March 5th absorbed the leftists by releasing the men that were about to be exonerated anyways. March 15th eliminated the right-wing element by putting a submachine gun rounds through a tracksuit. March 16th finished the job by making Suriname's surviving commando dependent on the regime for his own safety. So Bouterse had spent an entire year being the Dutch embassy's preferred moderate. And in the span of 10 days, in March of 81, he converted his two most dangerous factions into extensions of his own power. The left he wore like a costume. The right he simply shot. Neither move required him to hold any political conviction of his own. He was just one savvy chicken farmer. In episode 8, we described what Gladio looked like when an asset decided to go rogue, when the machinery that had encouraged him loses control of him. And this is what it looked like from inside the country when that was happening. Not Bouterse reading some Che Guevara book and waking up a Marxist, not a gradual left turn. It was a man being handed a BVD dossier by an ambassador who had had his nationalist feelings hurt, a man with a taste for power who had figured out that the political role that he had been playing, the moderate, stabilizing, pro-Western role, was now a liability. So he just shrugged it off like a snake shedding off its skin. The Wakaman adapts. The Wakaman reads the room. As Artigori would later put it, after the oath that he swore with Hawker and the other 15 had rotted down to one man in a hospital bed and another with a question mark beside his name, power changes people. What Gore didn't say, because he didn't have the words for it yet, was the corollary. Power reveals them too. On March 25th, 1981, Marsevain sat at his desk in the mission building and composed a letter to the new head of LAMID, the Army Intelligence Service, Colonel Bram Schulte. Now remember that name. The letter did two things. It formally categorized the behavior of Marsevain's own mission members under the heading Veiligheidsincidenten, security incidents, that the dissident Valkener cohort was generating. The way the strain inside the mission was creating exposure for the Dutch state at a diplomatic level. In a Nachschrift, which is like a little addendum that really careful officers' marginal notes for the institutional record, Marsevain warned that he believed that Captain Briaire and Captain Clements specifically were still being fed from Brussels, where Colonel Falk had been quietly transferred after the 1980 coup. He warned more broadly that the Netherlands was sitting in an exposed position, that leftist forces in Suriname were, even after the August 1980 coup purge and even after the March 1981 Hawker ambush, they were pushing the country toward what he called a socialist course modeled on Cuba, Nicaragua, and Grenada. He still believed that documentation mattered. He still believed that the chain of command would recognize what he was reporting. He still believed in the institutional response. The institutional response was already being prepared. It was not the response he was going to hope for. Schulte commissioned an internal investigation by Major Koenders, the landed counterintelligence officer who'd later investigate Marsevain's right-hand man in Paramaribo, Peter Maar, who had been left to complete his boss's work. Koenders' instructions were pretty narrow. Investigate the security incidents Marsevain and Maar had alleged. 5.5 months later, on September 7th, 1981, Koenders delivered his report. He came back with much more than what he had been asked to find. The report was classified, geheim persoonlijk, secret, personal, and it was routed under the cover slip from Major J. Fossa to Schulte on the same day. And it documented the August 1980 spy framing Mrs. Clement and Major Koeman had run. It documented Captain Clement's admission that the coup perpetrators had come into his home an hour after seizing power. It documented mission internal conversations, and it went much further than what Marsevain had asked it to do. It went back into the Valk-era, into the 1979 and Valk's conversation with junior Surinamese officers about coup possibilities. Pretty much the report's scope exceeded the brief. Then Koenders did something else. He delivered, in his conclusions, a geopolitical risk assessment that read like a break. Quote, "It must be assumed that Dutch actions against ex-NMMS members could have serious consequences for the relationship between the Netherlands and Suriname, and measured by Surinamese standards, the conduct of the ex-NMMS members is much more explainable and less reprehensible than it would be measured by Dutch standards. And on Valk specifically, the offenses committed by Colonel Valk lie more in the criminal and disciplinary area than in the security area." So if you read all of those lines in sequence, they are the architecture of a contained finding, a report that lays out the evidence of institutional misconduct, and then its conclusion builds a corridor down which the institution can walk away. Don't pursue it. The relationship matters more. By their standards, it's not so bad. The colonel's offenses were criminal and disciplinary, not security, meaning by implication that the matter belongs not with us in intelligence, but within regular military justice, and regular military justice was not going to be activated against the Dutch defense attaché in Brussels with NATO at the time. So the institutional language for this kind of report, the intelligence professionals who would later read it, was ruim de rommel op, clean up the mess. Schulte took the report. He went to Joris Demmink, at that time the head of legal affairs at the Defense Ministry, the man whose sign-off was needed to escalate this up the chain. Demmink read it. Demmink's verdict: the report contained only rumors and no new facts. He told Schulte to file the report in such a way that no one else, including the political administrative top of the Defense Ministry, which is to say the Secretary General and the Minister, would see it. Further investigation, Demmink argued, was impossible under Surinamese conditions and would only work to antagonize the regime in Paramaribo. So Schulte filed it away. The chain of command Marsevain had trusted when he sat at his desk on March 25th and wrote the letter did not run up. It ran into a drawer. Why Demmink made that call, why the civilian gatekeeper at the defense ministry whose sign-off needed to escalate the report instead built this corridor for the institution to walk past it, is a story we told in The Handler, because Demmink belonged to the Minerva alumni network. Hans Valk was the son of the man who had served as the military adjutant to Queen Beatrix. These connections, as we showed, ran all the way to the throne. What this episode is concerned with is not the why of the burial, it's the how. So the Prompt Commission 3 years later would find that Schulte and Demmink had withheld the report from the department leadership. The commission's verbatim language: the withholding of the report testified to an unacceptable arbitrariness, an onacceptabele Kunmachtigkeit. That's a tough one. Either way, the institutional body whose job it was to catch this kind of thing did eventually catch it 3 years late, long after Marcevin was out of Paramaribo, long after his successor had been forcibly expelled, long after Peter Maar was dead. The intelligence professionals who later reviewed Koenders' reports when De Vries interviewed them in 2019 and 2020 were divided on how to read it. Constant Heze, the Leiden Intelligence Studies lecturer, called it an internal note written for the service. Clean up the mess. Case Vibus, the pensioned analyst, who said the report carried substantial conclusions on meager evidentiary basis. And then decisively said the same thing that the Prompt Commission would say 3 years after the fact. Schulte should have informed the Secretary General. The defense minister should have been warned. He wasn't. By the end of 1981, the Marcevin file was the Overspannen file, the mental breakdown file. The colonel hadn't been right. The colonel had been mentally broken by the tropics. The reports could just be read as the warning shots of a man falling apart and then dismissed, because the man had come apart. Schulte himself, in his 2020 retrospective conversation with Ellen de Vries, would still be using the framing 40 years later. Marcevin was overspannen when he wrote this, and I can no longer take Marcevin seriously. A single word, the one word the institution chose to apply to its most senior counterintelligence officer in Paramaribo, and the institution's response to everything he had warned about could be filed away in a drawer. The professional did the professional thing. The institution was already at work on the language that would bury him. By the spring of 1981, the mission's collapse was no longer an internal Dutch matter. The Surinamese army was tired of the whole apparatus. The regime had decided it could function without Dutch military advisors, or rather that it could keep the Dutch advisors that it wanted. Captain Clements, who had already begun preparing his transition into the Bouterse army as a personal advisor, and they would just dispense with the structure. Bouterse's response was blunt. If you replace them, we don't need a mission at all. Send them all home. On April 16, 1981, the Surinamese government formally asked The Hague to terminate the Dutch military mission. Their stated reason: the National Army wanted to stand on its own feet. They would not be dictated by either Netherlands or its ally, America. The Hague agreed. Effective May 1st, 1981, the mission was officially dissolved. The Surinamese army leadership thought this meant that they were finally rid of Colonel Marcevin. They were wrong, because Marcevin, as you remember, wore two hats. The Hague executed a small bureaucratic maneuver. The mission was closed, but Marcevin technically remained in Paramaribo as the defense attaché, the DFAT, wearing his second hat. The first one was gone, the second one was still on his head. The Surinamese army leadership received this news on May 1 and grew quietly furious. In his last days as mission head, Marsevain made one final assertion of the Dutch chain of command. The Surinamese army leadership had organized this final farewell lunch for the ex-mission members, complete with flowers and gifts to celebrate the men who had spent the previous years undermining their commanding officer. Marsevain forbade his ex-subordinates from attending. He would not let men who had been working against him receive the Surinamese army's full ceremonial gratitude on the way out the door. This incensed the Surinamese army leadership. Behind closed doors, they started searching urgently, naarsticht in the Dutch, for ways to get at the colonel. On May 5th, 1981, Marsevain wrote to Colonel Schulte at Lamed in The Hague, listing a catalog of incidents: the exclusion from Lorwa's birthday party, the renewed spy framing by Miss Clements at the Surinamese Army's farewell celebration. The morale of his mission, in his own words, was deeply impacted. He was filing it all down for the record. The institutional record would matter later, even if it didn't matter right now. On May 10th, 1981, the embassy secretary in Paramaribo, Heldering, sent a cable back to the foreign ministry in The Hague. President Henk Chinesen called him. Chinesen, the civilian president whose government still nominally existed but whose authority extended only as far as the army would let it, was worried about Colonel Marsevain. Now, this is around the same time that President Reagan had had an assassination attempt as well. The Surinamese army leadership anger about Marsevain staying on as DFAT, Chinesen explained, could play out in three scenarios. The third, the one that Chinesen described as the most threatening, was that the colonel could suffer physical injury or worse, death. Heldering tried to push back. Marsevain was deeply expert. He loved Suriname. Chinesen replied plainly that he doubted there was room in the brains of the army leadership for any of that kind of rationality. The next day, on May 11th, the foreign ministry replied back. The cable went under copy to Joris Demmink at the defense ministry. The Minister of Foreign Affairs, also speaking for defense, agreed that Marsevain needed to come back to the Netherlands immediately. 2 days later, on May 13th, Marsevain physically left Paramaribo. The cover story was temporary consultations. It was not temporary. He had been recalled under the threat of death. He never went back to Suriname. In the first week of June 1981, Joris Demmink himself flew to Paramaribo to handle what was left of the situation. The talks with the Surinamese military went, in Demmick's later assessment, no calme, relatively well, all things considered. But on the question of Marsevain, he said, kein goed karoen te spinnen. Not good thread could be spun. The Surinamese army's resentment of him was, Demmink confirmed in writing on June 12th, very great. Demmink wrote to Marsevain personally about this whole thing. The senior defense minister officially signed his letter, Yours, Joris, the informal Dutch closing that signals two men who knew each other very well. So they knew each other. Demmink was the man inside defense handling the file. The same Demmink whose institutional career we will be following across the series here for the next few months to come. On June 23rd, from The Hague, Marsevain wrote a letter of his own. The recipient was his administrative secretary in Paramaribo. The secretary's name was Peter Maar. Maar had arrived in Paramaribo on April of 1981 to assist Marsevain with the mission. Within weeks, Marsevain was gone. Maar was alone in the embassy with a mission that had all been recalled, and a new attaché was not arriving until September. Maar would die a year and a half later on a stretch of road in Delft in what the Dutch state would call a single vehicle accident. We'll come back to him. Here's what Marsevain wrote. I am not coming back, not even to help my wife pack. This doesn't mean I am being blamed for anything here, but that they over there no longer want to see my face. A pity, but nothing to be done, and je ne regrette rien. Not sure what that one means, but history will hopefully one day reveal how something like this could happen. The man whose career had been reading Suriname for the Dutch intelligence, who had been chased out of the country under threat of death after 1 year as mission head, signed off in Edith Piaf's French, "I regret nothing." On July 8, 1981, the Dutch ambassador's residence in Paramaribo hosted a farewell reception for Colonel Marsevain. He was not present. Neither was his wife. She was, presumably, still packing. On July 13th, the Dutch military official Chronology Events in Suriname recorded an entry that closed the file. Definitive repatriation of Colonel Marsevain. Colonel Bas van Tussenbroek arrived in Paramaribo as the new DFAT in September of 1981, 3 months after Marsevain had been chased out and 2 months before the institutional machinery in The Hague would begin filing his entire tenure under one word: Overspannen. The man whose job had been to clean up the mission was now the man whose own report on the mission could not be trusted, because the report would say he had been mentally broken by the tropics. The mission in the end had succeeded, not at its stated work, at protecting itself. Marsevain had failed. He had failed to clean up what he had been sent to clean up. He had failed to break the Valk-era cohort. He had failed to surface the truth about the coup before it became unsurfaceable, and he had failed at the simplest task of all. He had failed to keep his own deputy, the man whose office was next to his, from running a third channel of the campaign that ended his career. What he had not failed to do was write it all down. The August 31st, 1981 report, the one we have been reading from throughout this episode, was filed from The Hague 2 months after his evacuation, by a man who the Dutch state already had begun to mark as mentally broken. Overspannen. The man writing it knew what had been said. He named the names. He preserved the verbatim Dutch. He recorded the intimate relationship and the representative income that wasn't being reported, and the welcome reception at Nija's house instead of his. I regret nothing in his closing letter to Peter Maar 6 weeks earlier. He filed the record, the state filed the colonel. History, he wrote, would hopefully reveal how something like this could happen. It is 45 years later. The record is still in the archive, the colonel is dead, and we are still working, sentence by sentence, footnote by footnote, on the answer to his question. So that's the year. Marsevain arrived in Paramaribo in mid-June 1980, expecting to clean up the Hans Valk mess, and discovered in 11 months that followed that the mess was not behind him. The mess was the people standing right around him, holding the same Dutch flags that he was holding, drawing the same Dutch salaries that he was drawing, and writing to The Hague to remove him. He had seen it all coming. He had documented what he could document. He had written the March 25th letter to Lamed naming Briaire and Clements explicitly. The professional did the professional thing, but it would not save him. I want to thank you again for watching this episode. I know you're not going to believe this, but this is actually the short section. I thought for sure that I was going to cut this down and make it shorter this time. I split this episode into 2 parts to make it shorter, and ended up being hours long anyways. Somebody asked me why I'm rehashing and going over this material that has already been covered by many others already. And it's a fair question, but I will say that it's not new material for many people in the United States. Most people up here have never heard the story about Suriname before. There's a lot of this that I hadn't heard before, and based upon the comments that I read on YouTube, there's a lot of it that you all haven't heard before either, whether you're just a younger audience or it just hasn't been part of the Suriname's history, official history. So I hope that you are getting some benefit out of listening to this, even if it's just humoring me by allowing me to go through it. The way that I learn is just by gathering all the information so I can understand the context. So I need to do this so that I can understand the American part of the story by understanding this too. So it may be taking a little longer to get through the story than we would hope, but it's enjoyable for me to understand this. I think that this is a human story. This is not just what happened in Suriname. This is what happens to anyone who gets a taste for power and doesn't want to let it go. It's about corruption, and it's about lies, and it's about the lengths that people will go to cover up the lies, and shame, and why things stay classified. So much of the content that we're covering from 46 years ago is still relevant to this day, and that's why I think it's worthwhile to pursue this type of story, even though it seems like a very old story. So either way, thanks again for tuning in this week. If you made it this far, go ahead and like this video. Go ahead and subscribe to the channel. It will help you get notified the next time something comes out. Check out and subscribe back on Substack. That's where I've got all the original citations for this episode. And you can catch up on some more of the series there. And go ahead and you can subscribe to the previous episode if you want to get caught up along the way. So have a great week, and we'll talk to you soon.